Adventures romantic and perilous. The search for the horse navigating the Ohio heroism of Mrs. Rowan Lawless gang's exchange of prisoners Boone revisits the home of his childhood, the realms beyond the Mississippi habits of the Hunters Corn Boone's journey to the west. The Indians still continued hostile. The following incident gives one an idea of the nature of the conflict which continued and of the perils which were encountered. There was a striving station where a few settlers were collected, at a spot now called State Creek Iron Works. One or two farmhouses were scattered around, but at such a short distance from the fort that their inmates could at once take refuge behind its log walls in case of alarm. In the month of August 1786, a young man residing in the fort by the name of Yates called at one of these farmhouses and requested a lad, Francis Downing, to accompany him in search of a horse which had strayed away. The two friends set out together, and after searching the forest in vain, found themselves, the latter part of the afternoon, in a lonely, uninhabited valley, nearly 7 miles from the fort. Here young Downing became quite alarmed by some indications that Indians were dogging their steps. He communicated his fears to his companion. But Yates, who was several years older than Downing, was an experienced hunter and inured to life in the woods, had become to a certain degree indifferent to danger. He made himself quite merry over his young companion's fears, asking him at what price he was willing to sell his scalp and offering to insure it for sixpence. Still Downing was not satisfied, and his alarm increased as he insisted that he occasionally heard the crack of dry twigs behind them, as if broken by someone pursuing. But Yates, deriding his fears, pressed on, making the woods resound with a song, to which he gave utterance from unusually full and strong lungs. Downing gradually slackened his pace, and when Yates was some 30 yards in advance of him, sprang into a dense cluster of tall whortleberry bushes where he was effectually concealed. Scarcely had he done this, when to his great terror he saw two Indians peeping cautiously out of a thick canebrake. Deceived by the song of Yates, who with stentorian lungs was still giving forth his woodland ditty, they supposed both had passed. Young Downing thought it impossible, but that the savages must have seen him as he concealed himself. Greatly alarmed, he raised his gun, intending to shoot one and to trust to his heels for escape from the other. But his hand was so unsteady that the gun went off before he had taken aim. Terror-stricken, he rushed along the path Yates had trod. Yates, alarmed by the report of the gun, came running back. As they met, the two Indians were seen not far from them in hot pursuit. They soon could easily see that the enemy was gaining upon them. In their rapid flight, they came to a deep gully which Yates cleared at a bound, but young Downing failed in the attempt. His breast struck the opposite almost precipitous bank, and he rolled to the bottom of the ditch. Some obstruction in the way prevented the Indians from witnessing the fall of Downing. They continued the pursuit of Yates, crossing the gully a few yards below where Downing had met his mishap. Thus, in less time than we have occupied in the narration, the Indians disappeared in their chase after Yates. Downing was in great perplexity. He did not dare to creep out of the gully lest he should be seen, and as soon as the Indians should perceive that he was not with Yates, as they inevitably would ere long do, they would know that he was left behind and would turn back for his capture. Unfortunately, young Downing had so far lost his presence of mind that he had failed to reload his gun. Just then he saw one of the savages returning, evidently in search of him. There was no possible resource left but flight. Throwing away his now useless gun, he rushed into the forest with all the speed which terror could inspire. He was but a boy. The full-grown Indian gained rapidly upon him. He could almost strike him with his tomahawk when they came to an immense tree blown up by the roots. The boy ran on one side of the trunk and the Indian on the other, towards the immense pile of earth which adhered to the upturned roots. The boy now gave up all hope in utter despair. It seemed certain that the brawny Indian would get ahead of him and intercept his further flight. But it so happened, was it an accident, or was it a providence, that a she-bear had made her bed directly in the path which the Indian with almost blind eagerness was pursuing. Here the ferocious beast was suckling her cubs. The bear sprang from her lair, and instantly with a terrific hug grasped the savage in her paws. The Indian gave a terrific yell and plunged his knife again and again into the body of the bear. The boy had but one brief glance, as in this bloody embrace they rolled over and over on the ground. The boy, praying that the bear might tear the Indian in pieces, added new speed to his flight and reached the fort in safety. There he found Yates, who had arrived but a few moments before him and who had outrun the other Indian. The next morning a well-armed party returned to the tree. Both the bear and the Indian had disappeared. Probably both had suffered very severely in the conflict, and both had escaped with their lives. Another incident illustrative of these perilous adventures in the now peaceful state of Kentucky. Mr. Rowan, with his own and 5 other families, left the little hamlet at Louisville to float down the Ohio to Green River and to ascend that stream, intending to rear their new homes on its fertile and delightful banks. The families were quite comfortably accommodated in a large flat-bottomed boat. Another boat of similar construction conveyed their cattle and sundry articles of household furniture. On the route which they were pursuing, there were then no settlements. The Ohio River and the Green River flowed through unbroken solitudes. The flatboats had floated down the beautiful Ohio, through scenes of surpassing loveliness, about 100 miles, when one night about 10 o'clock a prodigious shouting and yelling of Indians was heard some distance farther down the river on the northern shore. Very soon they came in sight of their campfires, which were burning very brightly. It was evident that the Indians were having a great carousal, rejoicing over some victory. Mr. Rowan immediately ordered the two boats to be lashed firmly together. There were but 7 men on board who were capable of making efficient use of the rifle. Plying the oars as vigorously and noiselessly as they could, they endeavored to keep close to the Kentucky shore. And yet they were careful not to approach too near, lest there might be Indians there also. It was evident that there was a large gathering of the Indians on the northern bank, for their campfires extended for a distance of nearly half a mile along the river. As the boats floated noiselessly along in the gloom of the night, under shadow of the cliffs, they were not detected until they were opposite the central fire, whose brilliancy threw a flood of light nearly across the stream. A simultaneous shout greeted this discovery, and with terrific yells the savages rushed to their canoes and commenced a pursuit. The two flatboats rapidly floated beyond the illumination of the fires into the region of midnight darkness. The timid Indians, well acquainted with the white man's unerring aim, pursued cautiously, though their hideous yells resounded along the shores. Mr. Rowan ordered all on board to keep perfect silence, to conceal themselves as much as possible, and ordered not a gun to be fired till the Indians were so near that the powder of the gun would burn them, thus rendering every shot absolutely certain. The Indians, with their hideous yells, pursued in their canoes until within 100 yards of the boats. They then seemed simultaneously to have adopted the conviction that the better part of valor was discretion. In the darkness, they could not see the boatmen, who they had no doubt were concealed behind bulletproof bulwarks. Their birch canoes presented not the slightest obstruction to the passage of a rifle ball. Knowing that the flash of a gun from the boat would be certain death to some one of their number, and that thus the boatmen, with the rapidity with which they could load and fire, would destroy a large part of their company before they could hope to capture the flatboats, they hesitated to approach any nearer, but followed in the pursuit for nearly 3 miles down the river, assailing the white men only with harmless yells. The heroic Mrs. Rowan, as she saw the canoes approaching, supposing that the savages would attempt to board the boats, crept quietly around in the darkness, collected all the axes and placed one by the side of each man, leaning the handle against his knee. While performing this significant act, she uttered not a word, but returned to her own seat in silence, retaining a sharp hatchet for herself. With such determined spirits to assail, it was well for the savages that they did not approach within arm's length of those whom they were pursuing. They would certainly have met with a bloody reception. The savages at length, despairing of success, relinquished the pursuit and returned to their demoniac orgies around their campfires. It was supposed that they had captured a boat which was descending the river the day before, and that their extraordinary revelry was accompanied by the roasting of their captives. A son of Mr. Rowan, but 10 years of age, who subsequently became one of the most distinguished men in Kentucky, was present on this occasion. He frequently, in after years, alluded to the indescribable sensations of sublimity and terror which the scene inspired. The gloom of the night, the solemn flow of the majestic river, the dim view of the forest on either side, the gleam of the campfires of the Indians, around which the half-clad savages were dancing in hideous contortions, the unearthly yells in which every demoniac passion seemed contending for the mastery, the shout which was given when they discovered the boats beneath the shadows of the opposite cliffs, the pursuit of the canoes with redoubled vehemence of hooting, the rapidity with which, with brawny arms, they paddled their boats to and fro, the breathless silence which pervaded the flatboat while for more than an hour the occupants awaited, momentarily expecting the terrible onset, and above all, the fortitude and heroism displayed by his mother, all these combined to leave an impression upon the mind of the boy which could never be obliterated. Few will be able to read the record of this adventure without emotion. What then must it have been to have experienced it in bodily presence, and to have shared in all its terrible dangers? As we have before said, there was no distinctly proclaimed war at this time between the pioneers and the Indians. While lawless men on both sides were committing the most atrocious outrages, the chiefs and the legitimate authorities were nominally at peace. The red men, whether engaged in what they deemed lawful warfare, or moving in plundering bands, were in the habit of inflicting upon their captives the most dreadful tortures which their ingenuity could devise. The white men could not retaliate by the perpetration of such revolting cruelty. It probably was a suggestion of Colonel Boone that a council might be held with the Indian chiefs, and a treaty formed by which prisoners should be exempted from torture and exchanged, as in civilized warfare. The Indians were by no means reckless of the lives of their warriors, and would probably be very ready to give up a white captive if by so doing they could receive one of their own braves in return. A council was held at a station where Maysville now stands. Colonel Boone was at once selected as the man of all others most fit to take part in these deliberations. He was not only thoroughly acquainted with the Indians, their habits, their modes of thought, and the motives most likely to influence their minds, but his own peculiar character seemed just the one calculated to inspire them with admiration. The principle was here adopted of an exchange of prisoners, which, notwithstanding the continued violence of the Lawless, saved the lives of many captives. It is an interesting fact, illustrative of the sagacity and extraordinary power of Colonel Boone over the Indian mind, that the chiefs with one consent agreed in grateful commemoration of this treaty, that if any captive should hereafter be taken by them from Maysville, that captive should be treated with every possible degree of lenity. And it is worthy of record that such a captive was subsequently taken, and that the Indians with the most scrupulous fidelity fulfilled their pledge. Indeed, it is difficult for an impartial historian to deny that these poor savages, ignorant and cruel as they were, often displayed a sense of honor which we do not so often find in their opponents. It is to be feared that were Indian historians to write the record of these wars, we should not find that they were always in the wrong. Colonel Boone, ejected from his lands and thus left penniless, felt keenly the wrongs which were inflicted upon him. He knew full well that he had done 1,000 times more for Kentucky than any other man living or dead. He had conferred upon the state services which no money could purchase. Though to his intimate friends he confided his sufferings, he was too proud to utter loud complaints. In silence he endured, but Kentucky had ceased to be a happy home for him. Over all its broad and beautiful expanse which he had opened to the world, there was not a single acre which he could call his own. And he had no money with which to purchase a farm of those speculators, into whose hands most of the lands had fallen. Could the good old man now rise from his grave, a Kentucky legislature would not long leave him landless. There is scarcely a cabin or a mansion in the whole state where Daniel Boone would not meet with as hospitable a reception as grateful hearts could give. As a grief-stricken child rushes to its mother's arms for solace, so it is natural for man, when world-weary and struggling with adversity, to look back with longing eyes to the home of his childhood. The remembrance of its sunny days animates him, and its trivial sadnesses are forgotten. Thus with Daniel Boone, houseless and stung by ingratitude, he turned his eyes to the far-distant home of his childhood on the banks of the Schuylkill. More than 40 years of a wonderfully adventurous life had passed, since he, a boy of 14, had accompanied his father in his removal from Reading in Berks County to North Carolina. Still, the remarkable boy had left traces behind him which were not yet obliterated. He visited Reading, probably influenced by a faint hope of finding there a home. A few of his former acquaintances were living and many family friends remained. By all he was received with the greatest kindness. But the frontier settlement of log huts and the majestic surrounding forests filled with game had entirely disappeared. Highly cultivated farms, from which even the stumps of the forest had perished, extended in all directions. Ambitious mansions adorned the hillsides, and all the appliances of advancing civilization met the eye. There could be no home here for Daniel Boone. Amid these strange scenes he felt as a stranger, and his heart yearned again for the solitudes of the forest. He longed to get beyond the reach of lawyers' offices and courthouses and land speculators. After a short visit, he bade adieu forever to his friends upon the Schuylkill, and turned his steps again towards the setting sun. His feelings had been too deeply wounded to allow him to think of remaining a man without a home in Kentucky. Still, the idea of leaving a region endeared to him by so many memories must have been very painful. He remembered vividly his long and painful journeys over the mountains, through the wilderness untrodden by the foot of the white man, his solitary exploration of the new Eden which he seemed to have found there, the glowing accounts he had carried back to his friends of the sunny skies, the salubrious clime, the fertile soil, and the majesty and loveliness of the landscape, of mountain, valley, lake and river which Providence had lavished with a prodigal hand in this garden of the Lord. One by one he had influenced his friends to emigrate, had led them to their new homes, had protected them against the savages, and now when Kentucky had become a prosperous state in the Union, containing 30,000 inhabitants, he was cast aside, and under the forms of law was robbed of the few acres which he had cultivated as his own. His life embittered by these reflections, and seeing nothing to attract him in the wild and unknown regions beyond the Mississippi, Colonel Boone turned sadly back to Virginia. It was an easy task for him to remove. In such an hour one can sometimes well say, "Blessed be nothing." A few pack horses were sufficient to convey all his household goods. It is probable that his wife and children, indignant at the treatment which the husband and father had received, were glad to leave. This was doubtless one of the saddest journeys that Colonel Boone ever undertook. Traversing an almost pathless wilderness in a direction a little north of east from Boonesborough, he crossed the various spears of the Allegheny Range, supporting his family with his rifle on the way, until after passing over 300 miles of the wilderness, he reached the mouth of the Kanawha River, as that stream flows from Virginia due north and empties into the Ohio River. Here there was a point of land washed by the Ohio on the north and the Great Kanawha on the west, to which the appropriate name of Point Pleasant had been given. It does not appear that civilization had as yet penetrated this region. The emigration to Kentucky had floated by it down the river, descending from Pittsburgh, or had crossed the mountain passes from North Carolina, several hundred miles to the south. Colonel Boone was now 55 years of age. If there were any settlement at the time at Point Pleasant, it must have consisted merely of a few log huts. Here at all events, Colonel Boone found the solitude and the communion with nature alone for which his heart yearned. The world might call him poor, and still he was rich in the abundant supply of all his earthly wants. He reared his log hut where no one appeared to dispute his claim. The fertile soil around, a virgin soil rich with undeveloped treasures under the simplest culture, produced abundantly, and the forest around supplied him daily with animal food more than a European peasant sees in a year. Here Colonel Boone and his family remained for several years, to use a popular phrase, buried from the world. His life was mainly that of a hunter. Mr. Peck, speaking of the habits of those pioneers who depended mainly upon the rifle for support, writes, "I have often seen him get up early in the morning, walk hastily out, and look anxiously to the woods and snuff the autumnal winds with the highest rapture, then return into the house and cast a quick and attentive look at the rifle, which was always suspended to a joist by a couple of buckhorns or little forks. The hunting dog, understanding the intentions of his master, would wag his tail, and by every blandishment in his power express his readiness to accompany him to the woods." It probably did not diminish Colonel Boone's interest in his new home that it was exposed to all the perils of border life, that his rifle should be ever loaded, that his faithful watchdog should be stationed at the door to give warning of any approaching footsteps, and that he and his family should always be ready for a siege or battle. With these precautions, Boone had no more fear of assault from half a dozen vagabond Indians than he had from so many howling wolves. The casualties of life had greatly reduced his family. Of his 3 sons, the eldest had fallen beneath the arrow and the tomahawk of the savages amidst the gloomy defiles of the Allegheny Mountains. His second son was killed at the dreadful Battle of the Blue Licks, as his agonized father had been compelled to abandon him to the merciless foe. His third son, probably chagrined by the treatment which his father had received from the authorities of Kentucky, had bidden adieu to all the haunts of civilized life, and traversing the wilderness towards the setting sun for many hundred miles, had crossed the Mississippi and sought a home in the wilds of the upper Louisiana, then under the dominion of Spain. As Boone was quietly engaged in his solitary vocation of farmer and hunter, where there were no books, no newspapers, nothing whatever to inform him of what was transpiring in the busy world of civilization or in the haunts of savage life, 2 or 3 hunters came one day to his cabin, where of course they met with a very hospitable reception. It was not difficult to entertain guests in those days. The floor of the cabin supplied all the needed accommodations for lodging. Each guest with his rifle could easily furnish more food than was desired for the whole family. A little cornmeal, very coarsely ground in what was called a tub mill, gave quite a variety of palatable food. Boiled in water, it formed a dish called mush, which when eaten with milk, honey, or butter presented truly a delicious repast for hungry mouths. Mixed with cold water, it was ready to be baked. When covered with hot ashes, it emerged smoking from the glowing embers in the form of ash cake. When baked upon a shingle and placed before the coals, it was termed journey cake, so called because it could be so speedily prepared. This name has been corrupted in modern times into Johnny cake. When baked upon a helveless hoe, it formed the hoe cake. When baked in a kettle covered with a heated lid, if in one large cake, it was called a pone or loaf. If in quite a number of small cakes, they were called dodgers. Corn flour seems to have been peculiarly prepared by Providence for the pioneers. For them it possesses some very great advantages over all other flour. It requires but few and the most simple cooking utensils. It can be rendered very palatable without either yeast, eggs, sugar, or spices of any kind. It can easily be raised in the greatest abundance and affords the most wholesome and nutritious food. Let paeans, writes Mr. Hartley, be sung all over the mighty West to Indian corn. Without it, the West would still have been a wilderness. Was the frontier suddenly invaded, without commissary or quartermaster or other sources of supply, each soldier parched a peck of corn. A portion of it was put into his pockets, the remainder in his wallet, and throwing it upon his saddle with his rifle on his shoulder, he was ready in half an hour for the campaign. Did a flood of emigration inundate the frontier? With an amount of consumers disproportioned to the supply of grain, the facility of raising the Indian corn and its early maturity gave promise and guarantee that the scarcity would be temporary and tolerable. Did the safety of the frontier demand the services of every adult militiaman, the boys and women could themselves raise corn and furnish ample supplies of bread. Did an autumnal intermittent confine the whole family, or the entire population to the sick bed, this certain concomitant of the clearing and cultivating the new soil mercifully withholds its paroxysms till the crop of corn is made. It requires no further labor or care afterwards. Paeans say we and a temple of worshipping to the creator of Indian corn. The hunters to whom we referred were indeed congenial companions to Daniel Boone. As day after day they accompanied him in the chase, and night after night sat by the blaze of his cabin fire, related to him the adventures they had encountered far away beyond the Mississippi, the spirit of his youth revived within him. An irrepressible desire sprang up in his heart again to become a pioneer in the pathless forest which he loved so well. It is not improbable also that his parental feelings might have been aroused by the consideration that his son had gone before him to that distant land, and that he might have been animated by the hope of being reunited with him in his declining years. The hunters represented to him that another Kentucky could be found beyond the Father of Waters, that the game was abundant and would be inexhaustible until long after his earthly pilgrimage should end, that the Spanish government, desirous of promoting emigration, were ready to make the most liberal grants of land to any man who would rear a cabin and commence the cultivation of the soil, that over an expanse of hundreds of miles of a sunny clime and as luxurious soil as heart could desire, he could select his broad acres with no fear of ever again being ejected from his home. These representations were resistless. Colonel Boone decided again to become a wanderer to the far west, though it involved the relinquishment of American citizenship and becoming a subject of the Crown of Spain. The year 1795 had now come, as Colonel Boone gathered up his few household goods for the fourth great remove of his life. He was born on the banks of the Delaware. His childhood was passed amidst the solitudes of the upper Schuylkill. His early manhood, where he reared his cabin and took to it his worthy bride, was in North Carolina. Thence penetrating the wilderness through adventures surpassing the dreams of romance, he had passed many years amidst the most wonderful vicissitudes of quietude and of agitation, of peace and of war, on the settlement of which he was the father at Boonesborough in the valley of the Kentucky River. Robbed of the possessions which he had earned 100 times over, he had sought a temporary residence at Point Pleasant in Virginia. And now, as he was approaching the termination of his 60 years, he was prepared to traverse the whole extent of Kentucky, from the Allegheny border on the east to the mighty flood of the Mississippi, which then upon the west rushed with its turbid flood through an almost unbroken solitude. It was a long, long journey. We can only surmise the reasons why he did not float down the Ohio in a flat boat. It may be said that he was entirely unaccustomed to boating. And as it does not appear that any other families joined him in the enterprise, his solitary boat would be almost certain to be attacked and captured by some of the marauding bands which frequented the northern banks of the Ohio. Colonel Boone was perfectly at home in the wilderness. He could always find a path for himself where there was no trail to follow, and but few Indians now ventured into the interior of the state. We have no record of the journey. He reached the Mississippi safely, crossed the river into what is now the state of Missouri, and found a warm greeting in the cabin of his son Daniel M. Boone, who had established himself upon the western banks of the river, near where the city of St. Louis now stands. A new home. Colonel Boone welcomed by the Spanish authorities Boone's narrative to Audubon. The midnight attack pursuit of the savages' sickness in the wilderness honesty of Colonel Boone payment of his debts loss of all his property. At the time when Colonel Boone crossed the Mississippi and entered Missouri, the Spanish government, then in possession of that territory, being anxious to promote the settlement of the country, gave a very cordial welcome to all emigrants. The fame of Colonel Boone, as one of the most bold and valuable of pioneers, had preceded him. The lieutenant governor under the Spanish crown, who resided at St. Louis, received him with marked attention and gave him the assurance that ample portions of land should be given to him and his family. Colonel Boone took up his residence with his son in what is called the Femme Osage district. The Spanish authorities appointed him commandant of the district, which was an office of both civil and military power. His commission was dated July 11, 1800. Remote as was this region from the Atlantic states, bold adventurers, lured by the prospect of obtaining large tracts of land, were rapidly pouring in. Instead of collecting together, they scattered wildly over the vast domain. Don Charles, the Spanish governor, gave Colonel Boone 8,000 acres of land on the north side of the Missouri River. By the law of the province, he was bound to build upon some part of this land a house within the year, and also to obtain a confirmation of the grant from the representative of the Spanish crown, then residing in New Orleans. Both of these precautions the simple-minded man neglected to adopt. To visit New Orleans required a journey through the wilderness of more than 1,000 miles. Though he might float down the stream in his boat, he would be exposed continually to attacks from the Indians on its banks, and when ready to return he could not surmount the rapid current of the river in his boat, but would be compelled to traverse the winding banks, often through almost impenetrable forests and morasses. His duties as syndic or justice of the peace also occupied much of his time, and the lieutenant governor at St. Louis agreed to dispense with his residence upon his lands. In addition to this, Colonel Boone had no doubt that the country would soon come under the power of the United States, and he could not believe the United States government would disturb his title. Soon after Boone's emigration to Missouri, the Emperor Napoleon, by treaty with Spain, obtained possession of the whole of the vast region west of the Mississippi and Missouri, then known as Louisiana, and the region was transferred to France. It is a curious fact in the history of Boone passing through such wonderful adventures that he had been a subject of George E.I., a citizen of the United States of the temporary nationality of Transylvania, an adopted son and citizen of the Shawanese tribe of Indians, a subject of Charles IV of Spain, and now he found himself a subject of the first Napoleon, whose empire was then filling the world with its renown. Not long after this, the emperor sold the country, as we have recorded, to the United States, saying with that prophetic wisdom which characterized this extraordinary man, "I have now given England a rival upon the seas." The fulfillment of this prophecy has since then been every hour in process of development. Colonel Boone seems to have been very happy in his new home. He still enjoyed his favorite pursuit of hunting, for the forests around him were filled with game and with animals whose rich furs were every year becoming more valuable. The distinguished naturalist J.J. Audubon visited him in his solitary retreat and spent a night with him. In his ornithological biography, he gives the following narrative which he received from Boone that evening as they sat at the cabin fire. We give the story in the words of the narrator. Daniel Boone, or as he was usually called in the Western country, Colonel Boone, happened to spend a night with me under the same roof more than 20 years ago. We had returned from a shooting excursion, in the course of which his extraordinary skill in the management of the rifle had been fully displayed. On retiring to the room appropriated to that remarkable individual and myself for the night, I felt anxious to know more of his exploits and adventures than I did, and accordingly took the liberty of proposing numerous questions to him. The stature and general appearance of this wanderer of the western forests approached the gigantic. His chest was broad and prominent. His muscular powers displayed themselves in every limb. His countenance gave indication of his great courage, enterprise, and perseverance. And when he spoke, the very motion of his lips brought the impression that whatever he uttered could not be otherwise than strictly true. I undressed while he merely took off his hunting shirt and arranged a few folds of blankets on the floor, choosing rather to lie there, as he observed, than on the softest bed. When we had both disposed of ourselves each after his own fashion, he related to me the following account of his powers of memory, which I lay before your kind reader in his own words, hoping that the simplicity of his style may prove interesting to you. I was once, said he, on a hunting expedition on the banks of the Green River, when the lower parts of Kentucky were still in the hands of nature, and none but the sons of the soil were looked upon as its lawful proprietors. We Virginians had for some time been waging a war of intrusion upon them, and I among the rest rambled through the woods in pursuit of their race, as I now would follow the tracks of any ravenous animal. The Indians outwitted me one dark night, and I was as unexpectedly as suddenly made a prisoner by them. The trick had been managed with great skill, for no sooner had I extinguished the fire of my camp and laid me down to rest in full security as I thought, than I felt seized by an undistinguishable number of hands, and was immediately pinioned as if about to be led to the scaffold for execution. To have attempted to be refractory would have proved useless and dangerous to my life, and I suffered myself to be removed from my camp to theirs, a few miles distant, without uttering a word of complaint. You are aware, I dare say, that to act in this manner was the best policy, as you understand that by so doing, I proved to the Indians at once that I was born and bred as fearless of death as any of themselves. When we reached the camp, great rejoicings were exhibited. 2 squaws and a few papooses appeared particularly delighted at the sight of me, and I was assured by every unequivocal gesture and word that on the morrow the mortal enemy of the Redskins would cease to live. I never opened my lips, but was busy contriving some scheme which might enable me to give the rascals a slip before dawn. The women immediately fell a-searching about my hunting shirt for whatever they might think valuable, and fortunately for me soon found my flask filled with strong whiskey. A terrific grin was exhibited on their murderous countenances, while my heart throbbed with joy at the anticipation of their intoxication. The crew began immediately to beat their bellies and sing as they passed the bottle from mouth to mouth. How often did I wish the flask 10 times its size and filled with aquafortis. I observed that the squaws drank more freely than the warriors, and again my spirits were about to be depressed when the report of a gun was heard at a distance. The Indians all jumped on their feet. The singing and drinking were both brought to a stand, and I saw with inexpressible joy the men walk off to some distance and talk to the squaws. I knew that they were consulting about me, and I foresaw that in a few moments the warriors would go to discover the cause of the gun having been fired so near their camp. I expected that the squaws would be left to guard me. Well, sir, it was just so. They returned, the men took up their guns and walked away. The squaws sat down again and in less than 5 minutes had my bottle up to their dirty mouths, gurgling down their throats the remains of the whiskey. With pleasure did I see them becoming more and more drunk, until the liquor took such hold of them that it was quite impossible for these women to be of any service. They tumbled down, rolled about, and began to snore when I, having no other chance of freeing myself from the cords that fastened me, rolled over and over towards the fire and after a short time burned them asunder. I rose on my feet, snatched up my rifle, and for once in my life spared that of Indians. I now recollected how desirous I once or twice felt to lay open the skulls of the wretches with my tomahawk. But when I again thought upon killing beings unprepared and unable to defend themselves, it looked like murder without need, and I gave up the idea. But, sir, I felt determined to mark the spot, and walking to a thrifty ash sapling, I cut out of it 3 large chips and ran off. I soon reached the river, soon crossed it, and threw myself into the cane brakes, imitating the tracks of an Indian with my feet, so that no chance might be left for those from whom I had escaped to overtake me. It is now nearly 20 years since this happened, and more than 5 since I left the white settlement, which I might never probably have visited again, had I not been called upon as a witness in a lawsuit which was pending in Kentucky, and which I really believe would never have been settled had I not come forward and established the beginning of a certain boundary line. The story is this, sir. Mr. moved from Old Virginia into Kentucky, and having a large tract granted to him in the new state, laid claim to a certain parcel of land adjoining Green River, and as chance would have it, took for one of his corners the very ash tree on which I had made my mark, beginning, as it is expressed in the deed, at an ash marked by 3 distinct notches of the tomahawk of a white man. The tree had grown much, and the bark had covered the marks. But somehow or other Mr. had heard from someone all that I have already said to you, and thinking that I might remember the spot alluded to in the deed, but which was no longer discoverable, wrote for me to come and try at least to find the place or the tree. His letter mentioned that all my expenses should be paid, and not caring much about once more going back to Kentucky, I started and met Mr. After some conversation, the affair with the Indians came to my recollection. I considered for a while, and began to think that after all I could find the very spot, as well as the tree if it were yet standing. Mr. and I mounted our horses and off we went to the Green River bottoms. After some difficulty, for you must be aware, sir, that great changes have taken place in those woods, I found at last the spot where I had crossed the river, and waiting for the moon to rise, made for the course in which I thought the ash trees grew. On approaching the place, I felt as if the Indians were there still, and as if I were still a prisoner among them. Mr. and I camped near what I conceived the spot and waited until the return of day. At the rising of the sun I was on foot, and after a good deal of musing thought that an ash tree then in sight must be the very one on which I had made my mark. I felt as if there could be no doubt about it, and mentioned my thought to Mr. "Well, Colonel Boone," said he, "if you think so I hope that it may prove true, but we must have some witnesses. Do you stay hereabouts and I will go and bring some of the settlers whom I know." I agreed. Mr. trotted off, and I, to pass the time, rambled about to see if a deer was still living in the land. But ah, sir, what a wonderful difference 30 years makes in a country. Why, at the time when I was caught by the Indians, you would not have walked out in any direction more than a mile without shooting a buck or a bear. There were then thousands of buffaloes on the hills in Kentucky. The land looked as if it never would become poor, and to hunt in those days was a pleasure indeed. But when I was left to myself on the banks of Green River, I dare say for the last time in my life, a few signs only of the deer were seen, and as to a deer itself I saw none. Mr. returned, accompanied by 3 gentlemen. They looked upon me as if I had been Washington himself, and walked to the ash tree which I now called my own, as if in quest of a long-lost treasure. I took an axe from one of them and cut a few chips off the bark. Still no signs were to be seen. So I cut again until I thought it time to be cautious, and I scraped and worked away with my butcher knife until I did come to where my tomahawk had left an impression on the wood. We now went regularly to work and scraped at the tree with care until 3 hacks, as plain as any 3 notches ever were, could be seen. Mr. and the other gentlemen were astonished, and I must allow that I was as much surprised as pleased myself. I made affidavit of this remarkable occurrence in presence of these gentlemen. Mr. gained his cause. I left Green River forever and came to where we are now, and sir, I wish you a good night. The life of this wonderful man was filled with similar adventures, many of which can now never be recalled. The following narrative will give the reader an idea of the scenes which were continually occurring in those bloody conflicts between the white settlers and the Indians. A widow was residing in a lonely log cabin, remote from any settlers, in what is now Bourbon County, Kentucky. Her lonely hut consisted of but 2 rooms. One the aged widow occupied herself, with 2 sons and a widowed daughter with an infant child. The other was tenanted by her 3 unmarried daughters, the oldest of whom was 20 years of age. It was 11 o'clock at night, and the members of the industrious family in their lonely habitation had retired, with the exception of one of the daughters and one of the sons who was keeping her company. Some indications of danger had alarmed the young man, though he kept his fears to himself. The cry apparently of owls in an adjoining forest was heard, answering each other in rather an unusual way. The horses in the enclosure by the side of the house, who seemed to have an instinct informing them of the approach of the Indians, seemed much excited and galloped around snorting with terror. Soon steps were heard in the yard, and immediately several loud knocks were made at the door, with someone inquiring in good English, "Who keeps this house?" The young man very imprudently was just unbarring the door when the mother sprang from the bed, exclaiming that they were Indians. The whole family was immediately aroused, and the young men seized their guns. The Indians now threw off all disguise and began to thunder at the door, endeavoring to break it down. Through a loophole prepared for such an emergency, a rifle shot discharged at the savages compelled a precipitate retreat. Soon, however, they cautiously returned, and attacking the other end of the cabin where they found a point not exposed to the fire from within, they succeeded at length in breaking through and entered the room occupied by the 3 girls. One of them they seized and bound. Her sister made desperate resistance and stabbed one of the Indians to the heart with a large knife which she was using at the loom. They immediately tomahawked her and she fell dead upon the floor. The little girl in the gloom of midnight they had overlooked. The poor little thing ran out of the door, and might have escaped had she not, in her terror, lost all self-control, and ran round the house wringing her hands and crying bitterly. The brothers, agonized by the cries of their little sister, were just about opening the door to rush out to her rescue, when their more prudent mother declared that the child must be abandoned to its fate, that any attempt to save her would not only be unavailing but would ensure the certain destruction of them all. Just then the child uttered a most frantic scream. They heard the dull sound as of a tomahawk falling upon the brain. There were a few convulsive moans, and all again was silent. It was but too evident to all what these sounds signified. Presently the crackling of flames was heard, and through the portholes could be seen the glare of the rising conflagration, while the shouts of the savages grew more exultant. They had set fire to the end of the building occupied by the daughters. The logs were dry as tinder, and the devouring element was soon enveloping the whole building in its fatal embrace. To remain in the cabin was certain death, in its most appalling form. In rushing out, there was a bare possibility that some might escape. There was no time for reflection. The hot, stifling flames and smothering smoke were rolling in upon them when they opened the door and rushed out into the outer air, endeavoring as soon as possible to reach the gloom of the forest.